Well, welcome everyone to session 6 of our study of the Gospel of Mark. Um, it's funny, it's such a quick gospel in so many ways in that, we've covered this initial section of introductions and kind of setting the stage, and then we get this foundational parable called the parable of the sower. And last week was kind of the first foray of Mark going into giving examples of the different types of soil to help give us some orientation, maybe to start seeing where the disciples fit into this, the different characters, where they all fit into it. And again, Mark uses the characters in the gospel not as historical figures, but as types, as a means to convey a message and a teaching from him to us. So we may find ourselves reacting, as many people have throughout history, to the sort of negative picture that we're often given of the disciples. And Mark is not presenting this so that we might judge the historical disciples. He's presenting it like this so that we might be able to see the different possible paths. In Mark's terminology, it's the different types of soil that are possible in terms of receiving the seed or the message of Jesus, the message of God, and then what we do with it. And it's all about bearing fruit. And again, the fruit that is born is simply the act of faith. And we see that because the definition of good soil is quite a liberating definition, because it's not about the family you have. It's not about your position in society. It's not about really even having the privilege of following Jesus so closely like the disciples. It's about simply being ready to receive. And that is, it's a wide open thing. So it's fairly liberating. It's not fairly, it's very liberating in terms of the new definition of what good soil is. But where we are right now is we're in this middle section from chapters 6 to 10. Mark will share with us a lot of different continuing examples to help us really get underneath what the different types of soils are and how you can react and what this means and what that, just to help orient us as an audience, to give us a more clear idea of where we're going or where we fit into the story. And so Mark will especially focus on the two, what I'll often call the two more negative types of soil. So you got the rocky soil, because let's face it, the good soil is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of explanation needed. Just like the path is really pretty straightforward too, because there's just no penetrating it. But the rocky soil is a little hard to tell the difference between the rocky soil and the good soil, at least at first. You see what I mean? And so we're starting to see that's where Mark will focus. And then Mark will also focus on the thorny soil, because as we've talked about briefly, the thorny soil is actually good soil. It's good soil. It's got possibilities, but it gets squeezed off because of those thorns growing, the invasive species growing right in the midst of it. So it chokes off the possibility for fruit. So Mark will spend a lot of time giving us examples of that, again, to help orient us. And in these sections, so about chapter 6 to middle of chapter 8, and then middle of chapter 8 to the end of chapter 10, we have these two major sections that help, kind of give us some details like this. And specifically today, we're going to be focusing more on the disciples. But again, we'll get to see some other examples too. But we'll get to see more on what Mark is doing with the disciples here, especially how there's this shift that we start to see happening between their initial receptivity and then what he comes to call hard-heartedness. From their initial response of faith and immediate going to fear, to something else. Okay, so there's something happening. And Mark, it's such a powerful, brilliant narrative presented, say, in the form of a play. We'll get to see a little bit of how Mark does that, because he used all sorts of narrative techniques. Now, in the notes, I want you to know that I've kind of made an outline of what we're going to be studying in the next couple chapters, because and maybe I should have done this from the beginning, but you can go back. It's really helpful to see kind of an outline and then to really be able to look back and make connections, because Mark uses a lot of categories and that, repetitively and uses geography and the sea, different actions, different places as a means of making connections to stories or as a means of moving the story. So an outline kind of helps us maybe see some of those patterns where when we study it episodically, from one chapter to the next or one section to the next, it kind of is easy to miss. But that's my job, to try to help us see those. And then I hope that our job as we move and become more proficient in our study of these texts, that we start seeing the patterns ourselves. And that's where I'll leave it for today as far as the introductory comments, and throw it open to you. Any kind of initial questions or comments that have arisen from this chapter that you've read for today, or anything previous? Marilyn? Unmute, we want to hear you. Yeah.
Can't read lips.
There you go. Oh, I can read them a little bit.
A little bit, okay. Anyway, what you've said so far answers a concern that I had, that I was for sure going to bring up.
Yeah.
And that has to do with Jesus teaching in the synagogue, in his home community.
Yep.
And just really people being quite rejecting
Yes.
of him. And who in the world is this to be saying these things and doing these things? And
yes.
I thought, wait a minute, I want to know what he said. What did he say? Well, now from what you've been saying, that wasn't Mark's point.
Right.
Mark's point was where it was happening. And well, anyway, I will look forward to finding out what Mark's point was.
Yeah, well, I mean, he uses these are, because that's a really memorable episode, right? It's this time, but what we might have experienced when we read these is like, wait a second, that already happened, or I heard that before. And it should ring chords in us, and to maybe compare, or at least to understand that these are oral cues that Mark is using to help us connect sections of the story. And we'll get to that. But it's really good to notice, okay, I might react to a section or a story in one way, and then maybe take that step back again and say, all right, is what I'm reacting to necessarily what Mark is trying to communicate? And that's part of the work here, because it may be, but it may also just be that we've received so much through the tradition of church, and again, that's why the church sort of rejected the Gospel of Mark for so many centuries, because it was such a negative picture of the disciples. It seemed unresolved. That's why they wrote that ending section in the end of chapter 16 to try to make it cohere more with the Gospels that people liked better, because they reached resolution. And it's just it's unfortunate, because it laid that all on top of Mark, and I think, and many think, that that's never what Mark's intention was. So it's always good for us to kind of react, no problem. That's good to find reaction and response, but then to look at it again and see, all right, is this what Mark may really be saying, or could it be something else? Any other questions or comments? Thank you, Marilyn.
You're welcome.
Seeing no hands. All right, so we'll do this again today with the reading sections. You'll see when I flip over to the chapter 6, it'll be sections. So it won't necessarily be a paragraph, but you'll see the headings. So the volunteers, please, I'll be scrolling the text for you. Just please read that section, because it's not a short chapter. None of the chapters are particularly long, but it's got a little bit more meat in it than we've seen previously. So before I switch over, can I see a hand for the first person who would like to read, and then the rest just kind of volunteer as we go, if you don't mind. Who would like to start us? Horty. Okay, and then Carol, you can go next. All right, let me switch over here to the text. All right, go for it. Oh, I'm sorry, the muting, yeah.
Minor detail, there we go.
There you go.
Okay, the rejection of Jesus at Nazareth. He left that place and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astounded They said, "Where did this man get all this? What is this wisdom that has been given to him? What deeds of power are being done by his hands? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, a brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Then Jesus said to them, "Prophets are not without honor, except in their hometown and among their own kin and in their own houses." And he could do no deed of power there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and cured them. And he was amazed at their unbelief.
Thank you. Carol, can you read the mission of the 12?
Then he went about among the villages teaching. He called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on 2 tunics. He said to them, "Wherever you enter a house, stay there until you leave the place. If any place will not welcome you and they refuse to hear you, as you leave, shake off the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them." So they went out and proclaimed that all should repent. They cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them.
Okay, thank you. And now we come to the next death of John the Baptist. Can I get a volunteer for that? Sue? Thank you, Sue.
The death of John the Baptist. King Herod heard of it, for Jesus' name had become known. Some were saying, "John the Baptizer has been raised from the dead, and for this reason these powers are at work in him." But others said, "It is Elijah." And others said, "It is a prophet, like one of the prophets of old." But when Herod heard of it, he said, "John, whom I beheaded, has been raised." For Herod had sent men who arrested John, bound him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because Herod had married her. For John had been telling Herod, "It is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife." And Herodias had a grudge against him and wanted to kill him. But she could not, for Herod feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and he protected him. When he heard him, he was greatly perplexed, and yet he liked to listen to him. But an opportunity came when Herod, on his birthday, gave a banquet for his courtiers and officers and for the leaders of Galilee. When his daughter Herodias came in and danced, she pleased Herod and his guests. And the king said to the girl, "Ask me whatever you wish, and I will give it." And he solemnly swore to her, "Whatever you ask me, I will give you, even half of my kingdom." She went out and said to her mother, "What should I ask for?" She replied, "The head of John the Baptizer." Immediately she rushed back to the king and requested, "I want you to give me at once the head of John the Baptist on a platter." The king was deeply grieved, yet out of regard for his oaths and for the guests, he did not want to refuse her. Immediately the king sent a soldier of the guard with orders to bring John's head. He went and beheaded him in the prison, brought his head on a platter, and gave it to the girl. Then the girl gave it to her mother. When his disciples heard about it, they came and took his body and laid it in a tomb.
Thank you, Sue.
You're welcome.
Next person for the feeding of the 5,000. Marilyn? Okay.
The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Next section is Jesus walks on the water. I'll jump in there on this one, and then someone can do the last one because we'll have one more. I didn't see any hands. Okay, so Jesus walks on the water. Immediately, he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost, and they cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. Last section.
When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him, and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed.
Thank you all. Oh, so many details in there, and I wonder if some stuff just jumped out to you, but I hope we'll get to it and be able to kind of just enjoy and savor this this wonderfully crafted narrative here. So let's just start at the first section there, those first 6 verses. Can you just even on a general level tell me how in those 6 verses, first of all, what are some of the differences between the disciples and the people who are healed? And then how does that relate to what happens in 1 to 6? Let's just get that general. So, the disciples are one way, the people who are healed are another. How does those first 6 verses kind of give us any sense of connection to that? What does that tell us, those first 6 verses? Who thinks they have a claim on Jesus? Who thinks they know who Jesus is? Marilyn? Okay.
Sometimes I feel like I talk too much.
But I get it too. Not that you talk too much, but I get why it can be hard because I'm asking you to read back, and we've just looked at this. It's all good, but yeah, start, and then others will have an opportunity. Just go for it.
Well, one of the things that strikes me is that the fact that the people in his hometown who would feel that they really knew him, like the disciples would feel like they really knew him,
Yes.
They just couldn't accept that this person they knew could really do all these things. They didn't have the faith.
Right.
People who traveled a whole bunch of distances with their sick and everything. Yeah, they wouldn't have done that if they didn't have faith that Jesus could make their relatives well.
Exactly.
And
go ahead.
So anyway, and then that section ends with, so he really wasn't able to do anything there.
Yeah, it captures so much of what we've learned about how healing works in Mark. So you've covered it all. You know, Mark is speaking to a world in which those who had the blood relations, those who had the positions of privilege, had the power, had everything. And Mark is trying to say, no, in Jesus' world, in Jesus' family, in the kingdom of God, it has nothing to do with your standing as a blood relative, as they illustrate in this. They don't get it. They think they have a claim on Jesus. They think they see him for who he is, but they're really just judging him based on that limited knowledge. And Mark has already shown us that family way of seeing him creates them. It makes those who think they're insiders actually on the outside, because it's the faith that matters. That's what illustrates the good soil. That's what makes you receptive. That's what makes you a part of the Jesus movement, not your position of privilege like the disciples, and not your blood relations to Jesus. So that's Mark setting it up. And how healing works. Healing doesn't create faith in Jesus. Healing only happens when faith is present already. And so that's why that beautiful, powerful little verse that says Jesus could do no works of power there because there was so little faith. It's Mark just kind of reiterating for us, this is how it works, okay? So all the ways that we think we know who Jesus is, if we're part of his blood family or if we're the disciples, it ain't the case. And that's very liberating, because as the audience, we're not Jesus' blood family and we're not the disciples. And how many of us were raised in churches that sort of focused on, well, you know, the disciples, they had this powerful advantage and that's why they were so chosen. And no, Mark's not worried about the chosenness of the disciples. No, Jesus chooses them, but Mark uses them as an illustration of really how the soil is not so good in those who are in that close proximity to Jesus necessarily. It opens the door wide open to who can be a member of his family. So that's sort of established. Those 6 verses kind of reiterate that theme that Mark has brought up. And any questions or comments about that? Okay. So as we look at the way it's laid out there, with the pattern that we see, there are significant connections between what is stated in chapter 6, verses 1 through 34, and what we saw previously in chapter 3, verses 7 to 35, okay? I know it's a lot to look back, and you'll have I'll give you, I have some notes that'll cover it, but let's just say this, because it might be unfair to ask you to remember all that. But for the perspective of the audience that Mark is speaking to, the initial call story of the disciples that happened in chapter 3 had a pattern to it. And in chapter 3, and I wrote this down so I don't mess it up, chapter 3, the pattern is Jesus is by the sea, and then there are crowds from many towns that come in, and then there's this boat, and there's healing. And then Jesus calls and appoints the 12, okay, after that. And then and the last thing is this controversy with those who are near Jesus or who are insiders, who think they are, and this rejection of the old way of being family, okay? That's the whole wineskins thing. Okay, so that's chapter 3. Here in chapter 6, we see those same themes, but in reverse. So it starts with this reassessment of whose family and how the family rejects Jesus. And then they go into this description of the 12, and the sending of the 12. And then it's more boat stories, and into, the healing that happens on the boat. So it's this, Mark is using it as an oral means of making connections to the story and to who the disciples are. So the question then that I will ask you, and I would love your reflection on, is why? Why do you think Mark does this? Why does he do these pattern things? Carol?
Is it, oh, I have a good thought in it.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Raise that hand again. No, I get it. I get it. It's a lot to hold on to here. Anyone else? Why do you think Mark? Oh, you remembered. Okay, and then I'll come to Horty. Okay.
Because Jesus was flipping everything over. The way Jesus was getting people to think was just the opposite. And so Mark is saying, I will flip everything.
Ah, yeah. Well, that's a good point. So from a narrative perspective, you know, he is asking, he's using this means of going, you know, here's three things, and then here's presented them in sort of the opposite. He's sort of bookending a section here, helping us to see something that's vitally important. And certainly the way that Jesus interacts with the world and with those around him is he is flipping the script in every way. All the expectations, you know, again, people would have expected the good soil to be the, you know, the religious elites, of course, right? Because they're religious. It's like the people that come up to me and say, hey, can you pray for me because you're closer to God? You know, all these ways that they just make these assumptions. They think, oh, your blood family, and that's obviously going to be closer. Mark is telling us, and having Jesus reiterate this, that's just not the case. And your soil has everything to do with your faith and not your position in this world. That is a flipping of the script. Absolutely. Absolutely. Horty, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No. No, I'm often hit by when you talk about the repetition and the point that he's wanting to make by, come on, get it. I'm coming at it from a little different perspective, but I want you to get the point.
Yeah, yeah. He wants us to see it. And so it's not always repetition just for the sake of repetition, so we'll finally drum it in. In this case, something has happened in between the telling of these two that gives the audience, us, a whole different perspective. Okay? That's a big key to this too. Now, what is it that's happened between those stories? So let's say the call stories, the initial call story of the disciples, and then this reiteration of that call story. What's happened in between that gives us a whole new perspective on the disciples? We had the parable of the sower. And what we've seen by that parable is this understanding that when Jesus nicknamed all those disciples and he called Peter the rock, he wasn't just referring to like the nice, cool nickname like the wrestler of modern age or just the rock of the foundation of the church. No, he was calling him the rock as in the rocky soil. What we've seen is that from that initial positive assessment where they all immediately went and they went out and did all these great things and it was so wonderful, we've seen some shifting. And by the end of chapter 4, we knew that these very ones that Jesus called, there's going to be some problems. We already have seen that one of them, Judas, was going to be a betrayer of him. We know there's been a lot of foreshadowing already, and now we've already started to see how the disciples are not exhibiting the good soil that we thought they were. They're showing some cracks. They're showing a lack of faith. They're starting to show more fear. And that's what Mark is. He reiterates it because stuff has happened in between the two, and now as an audience, it's like, oh my gosh, now I see it. I'll use another example. Any of you who have gone maybe as a kid to the symphony, you can go and you can listen to the symphony, and as a kid, you might fall asleep, you might really half pay attention or whatever. But if the conductor comes out and you're a youth and says, all right, kids, it's not just music. I want you to listen for this part and the way it communicates with this part over here. And when this part stops, pay attention to how this one starts up. And what does that create in you? The conductor makes it a story that's connected. And all of a sudden, this just what would have just been music and notes as a kid, and you would have listened to it and maybe gotten it, maybe not. We're given an orientation. We're giving a means of connecting to that piece that helps us get understanding and appreciation. Mark is sort of doing that with us right now. He's showing us some pieces and how they fit that gives us a better orientation to the story and helps us more deeply appreciate, I see now. Those disciples, wow, it's not what it seems. And some of the ways he's presenting them, showing me that, okay, that's what rocky soil looks like. It starts off great, but then it sort of falls away. Questions or comments? Yeah, Kathleen? There you go.
One of it might even come from Mark, but one of my favorite Bible verses is, it goes like this, but it reminds me of all these disciples. I believe, help thou my unbelief.
Yep.
And I play with that a lot in my not daily, but weekly, monthly life, because I sort of like those disciples. I can be gung-ho and then, oops,
Yeah, and that's a powerful theme for Mark too. What we saw last week, the woman with the hemorrhage exhibited that very kind of faith that you just named, because as it says, she had the faith to dare to reach out and believe that just by touching the hem of his cloak that she would be healed. But then when he called her out, Mark says she was in fear and trembling. And so she was riding that line. And she was able to overcome her fear because of her faith. That's what that story illustrates. Mark is trying to tell us that it's not about having full, perfect faith, 100% faith or no faith. But Mark is saying that even the smallest amount of faith can overcome fear. It may not necessarily overcome fear. We see in the examples of the disciples places where it doesn't, where fear can overwhelm faith. Fear can absolutely make faith impossible. But even the littlest amount of faith can overcome fear. That's what we're seeing in that example of the woman. And then that line that you named, that's exactly what that's illustrating as well. I believe. You're stating some level of belief. Help my unbelief. When you start with that premise of I believe, that's the seed of faith right there. Mark and Jesus can work with that. Okay? But if you start from the premise of, I don't believe, so give it to me, give me something. It's like, well, that's not good soil. There's no seed that can penetrate that. See what I mean? And Mark plays with that. And that's part of the way he's shaping the narrative to help us orient and understand, okay, this is what faith looks like. This is what faith doesn't look like. He's shaping us as responders, not just as an audience passively hearing this. Any other comments? It's good stuff. All right, so I love how Mark does this because he's got the sending story, right? And at the end of the sending story of the disciples in chapter 6 here, it's really positive. They go out and they're casting out demons, and the disciples are curing people, and it's really good. They're going out 2 by 2, and it's really good. And then we see the story of Herod and John the Baptist. Why do you think Mark puts Herod's story right in the middle of the disciples' mission narrative? What does that do? Perry?
I gotta be unmuted.
Okay,
so,
yeah.
I was sitting here visiting with Kathleen, and I said, I don't understand why it's there at all.
Uh-huh.
You brought it up, and she said to me, wait till Dan brings it up, and then we'll get to that.
But do you have any sense? Okay, I'm glad that you felt that way, because it should be jarring. But now, do you have a sense of why Mark would put it there?
No, that's why I'm asking. I wouldn't ask.
Okay, we'll get to it. Why do does anyone have an idea or a thought? Jay, and then Carol.
Is it to give an extreme of how even someone like Herod, who you would think would be closed-minded or not open to belief, you see that he is open to belief, just like anyone with rocky soil, or that could be classified as rocky soil. They're open to the idea of some kind of faith or belief, or basically the positivity of it being true.
Okay, I like a lot of what you're saying, but there's some stuff I want to clarify in there, because I would agree that Herod exhibits some really positive qualities. I hope you saw that, because we talked about it previously. Back in like chapter 2, or no, it was chapter 3, where Mark makes the connection between the people who hear and being good soil. Like he says, that he uses the word to hear 13 times in a short period of verses. And he makes the association of those who hear well, those who have ears to hear, that sort of thing, and being good soil. And how many times in this little passage he is saying that Herod liked to hear John. He didn't understand him, but he liked to hear him. He liked to listen to him. It's illustrating that Herod has some good qualities. He's got good soil. He's got potential. But there's a big but, okay? Something gets in the way. Now, is that rocky soil? Is that another kind of soil? It's not rocky soil, because that's the disciples. It's the thorny soil. That's the thorny. And that's where it's the same thing with that. Remember the rich young ruler? It's classic. Yep. That's what illustrates the thorny soil. But you're right in the sense that there's positive stuff that Herod's illustrating. And then this is a shocking story. And notice how much detail Mark gives to this story. He gives so scant detail about all the stuff the disciples are doing, or it's just basically a list of what they've done. And then this rich, very powerful story of Herod, okay, that really draws our attention and just jarringly butts in to the disciples' story. Okay, so there's that. Any other comments? I saw Carol, and did I see Horty? I'll try to let other people speak on this. Why do you think this story appears here? Carol?
Well, what I felt was he's sending them out, everything's beginning to go well, and then suddenly you get this horrible story. And it's like, wait a minute, we were just on our way, we were going to get some traction, and then you throw this in.
Absolutely, that's it. That is it. And so this story, when everything's looking good, this is the way Mark does it. When he inserts stories like this, and this is true, this is consistent the way he does this, and we'll come to some more powerful examples. This way of inserting, it's Mark's way of saying these stories are connected somehow. What this is a foreshadowing. It's a means of saying, yeah, the disciples look like they're doing great. But this very way that Herod looked like he was doing great too foreshadows the very way that the disciples will also fall away in different ways, in their own rocky soil way, but they too will fall away when persecution arises. Okay, we know this already because we know the story. But this is that first sort, this is not the first foreshadowing. The first foreshadowing was when the disciples were first called and named. And you saw the sons of thunder, and you're like, whoa, what's this kind of, combative kind of tone here? Oh, and then Judas, the one who will betray him. There's been foreshadowing already. This is another example of inserting a story here that takes that positive, happy feeling of them being successful, and boom, got this Herod story that illustrates that things are not going to continue to go this way. Okay? Brilliant. It's a brilliant foreshadowing of the way the disciples will roll, and it's really only second to the crucifixion itself. Okay? Any responses? Does that jive? Do you see where I'm going with this? Any other comments? Horty?
It's in any life, things may be going well, and all of a sudden there's a right turn in our own lives. There are things that happen even when we don't see the foreshadowing, but there are dramatic things that happen that change our direction, even when we personally may be feeling things are on an even keel, or we're even doing really well. And things happen, and that's a fact of life. Poop happens. And that's what it brought to me, is that jolt when unexpected difficulties come into our lives.
Yeah.
And that's what it brought up for me, because it is such a visceral story. It is such a visceral story.
It is. And, I think you're bringing up something that I want to highlight here. And this really, I hope it's helpful. And that is when Mark tells us about these 4 different types of soil, always remember, these are metaphors. And so on some level, each character who exhibits a type of soil, there's possibility, there's openness. Mark even leaves room, and you'll see it. There's positive things that Pharisees even can have down the road. And the point is that each of us can be a different kind of soil. We are not like assigned our soil. And Mark tells the story the way he does to help us understand as an audience. But the truth is, Herod could have chosen differently. If he had simply stood up and done what was right, and not for the sake of his pride and his oath and all that, but done what was right, it could have been different. The thorns might, it would have been, he had a choice. Okay. And there's choice here. So that, I think, is a part of this too. But again, that's a metaphor. The soil is a metaphor, and it's trying to help us understand these are the types of responses. What are you going to do, audience? How are you going to respond? That's what's being shaped here. And I agree that, so many times we see these and we respond because we know in our own lives, those places where we've been unreceptive path, or we've been enthusiastic initially, but then bumped our head into fear or resistance or a change of direction because life happens. Or maybe we've gotten a good start, and then work, stress, life, money, whatever has squeezed it out of us like thorns. See where I'm going? So it's possible to make choices that are different than the assignment of soil. This is not about an assignment of soil to every person. Okay, we are all free. There's freedom within that. Horty?
I just wanted to say that my response often is, at different times, I'm all those kinds of soil.
Right, exactly. No, I think that's true. That's true. But for the sake of clarity, Mark is using these types to help us really get behind, okay, I see now how doing that exhibits that type of soil. So I think I'm being good soil, but and again, it's not about saying you're good, you're bad. It's helping clarify, this is what faith looks like. This is where faith can be found. And faith is all that is necessary to be a part of the kingdom of God. It's liberating. Okay, it's not telling us finger wagging. It's more about open yourselves to it. Okay.
And we are all each of those types.
Exactly. And I think that's a given. That's a given, is that we all exhibit those types, right? The types of
So it's not about finger pointing. It's about assuming it within ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. It's about accepting. It's about receiving that reality. Bertie, and then Marilyn.
I would like to go back a moment to the disciples and when they were sent out.
Yeah.
And if you need faith for healing, and the disciples were healing, then that says that they were fostering faith.
Right.
And so that's before they were really rocky soil. They were still good soil when they went out.
Absolutely. Yeah, because that's the nature of rocky soil, is that the way the parable of the sower describes it. Things do grow in it. It's just that they reach this place where the roots can go no deeper, and then they wither and die. So that's part of it. There is positive stuff to be said about rocky soil. It's just seeing it for what it is. And Mark is saying, look, I get that rocky soil initially appears to be good soil. Well, here's how it's not. Okay, here's what it looks like when it's not. Here's what happens. And what is it that gets in the way? What is the rock that the roots hit? It's often fear.
Fear.
Yeah.
Fear.
And that's what Mark's trying to help us see. See, he's not trying to slam the disciples. Oh, they're terrible. No, he's trying to illustrate that fear can interrupt faith. That's the message for us. That's what we need to take in. And all these stories that are so wonderfully designed to stick with us are helping to communicate that message, so that by the end of the gospel, we have a better sense of clarity of what faith looks like. I saw one other hand. Darn it, the screen switched. Oh, okay. I called on Marilyn, then I see Boyce and Sue.
Wait a minute. Yeah, okay, you can hear me.
You're good.
I've reacted really strongly to reading about King Herod right at the beginning of this, and his positive kind of ways that he was responding to John the Baptist, and how he just couldn't do what this new wife wanted him to do, and then the daughter comes and kind of brings up something else in him.
Yep.
And so he goes ahead and has John the Baptist beheaded, and then such a grueling scene of having the head being brought into this party and everything. But there are some ways in which seeing these kind of changes, I am finding to be very reassuring, because I'm not always going to be this wonderful soil.
No.
And anyway.
Yeah, and that whole scene is supposed to be shocking and gruesome, and it's like over the top compared to so many of the other stories that Mark tells, and he does that on purpose. There's never any sort of just like, oh, he just added that because it was, he thought it would just be more effective. No, well, it is more effective, but it's not just a throwaway. He's trying to really shock us and make us be like, oh God, that's terrible, that's disgusting, and what an idiot. Why would he do that? We're supposed to react these ways. And I'm not trying to say that's the only ways. Obviously, there's lots of ways. But we're supposed to see that scene and have a reaction. Have a reaction. It should jar us. And it's partly the way we react to Herod as an example of thorny soil, but it's also partly setting us up for how we react to the disciples themselves because of where it's inserted, where it's been put in. It just sort of interrupts that positive, happy feeling, and then gives us this and says, this is sort of a foreshadowing here. The falling.
Well,
Yep.
I think the point I was making had two pieces to it. So the very first part here, where King Herod heard about this, liked what John the Baptist had to say and liked to listen to him and everything, all of that positive, good soil,
yeah,
was a real shock to me. I didn't expect to read that about King Herod. And that's how I reacted when I read this last night to get ready for today. It wasn't just today.
Right.
And anyway.
Yeah, the thorns of being king, the thorns of oath, the thorns of being beholden to his sexual interest in his daughter, his stepwife's daughter, or whatever, not stepwife, his wife's daughter. All that stuff are the thorns that basically envelop him and make him do something hideous.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Boys, did you have something you wanted to add? Captain Boyce?
Let's do Sue first, because I'm so off base. I distract from what she might.
Yeah, but you might be stealing home, and that's always exciting too.
Well, I'm probably stealing first.
Okay. All right. If you insist, I'll go to Sue, and then we'll come back to you though. So be ready.
I will.
Go ahead, Sue.
My point that I wanted to make was about Herod and the foreshadowing, but also the foreshadowing of his weakness and his inability to stand up for what he really wants, but he gives in to the peer pressure, which is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen later when he really doesn't want to have Jesus killed, but he gives in to the pressure.
Well, and you're correct. You're talking about Pilate. You're talking about Pilate in that case.
Okay.
But you're exactly right. It's a foreshadowing of another government official who sees and knows, and actually there's some positive things that we'll see about how Pilate is described. We'll see the same pattern emerge. His unwillingness or his inability to make a decision that is actual right decision in that case. Yeah. He leaves it up to the throngs, in that case. So anyway, that's a good noticing. It's foreshadowing not just for the disciples, it's foreshadowing for other thorny soil examples that we will see, which Pilate is one of them. Boyce, we're coming back to you.
Okay, here goes.
All right.
I'm picking up a message in the background, perhaps. that Mark may not have intended, but for me makes sense, and I experienced it myself. In here, Jesus goes to his hometown and preaches, and he's not accepted very well. And they look at him, he's a boy from us, and we know his family, and what does he know? And then anyway, in my life, past life, when I worked, I would be sometimes asked to go do trainings or give presentations to other administrators or teachers on something that I knew something about and pretend like I was an expert. And I noticed that when I did those presentations close to home, where the other educators knew me.
Mm-hmm.
It was a different presentation than when I traveled. And somebody then told me, when I was talking to another presenter, said, well, you're not an expert unless you're 100 miles away from home. And all of a sudden that rang. And I see this here with Jesus.
Sure. Yep.
And I think that, okay, our past perceptions influence our present understanding.
Yep.
And so I don't know if Mark meant this, but Jesus is coming with a new understanding of Scripture, of God. And I'm wondering if he is also saying, you guys grew up with a different understanding with what you have been presented by the priests and the other religious leaders, and now you have this new person coming with something new, and you're having a hard time accepting it because of your past beliefs or past understandings.
Yep, that is what Mark is trying to say.
Same with Herod. We have feelings of Herod, and even we don't like Herod. We see him as a bad guy, but here he's presented, he does have a good side, and he does have this. And so it's kind of like that theme seems to be there, but I'm not sure that Mark intended that.
Oh, no, it's exactly what he's intending, because all of these characters fall into different types. They're exhibiting different types of soil. So the family that thinks they assess and know Jesus, who he is, they are unwilling. So they may well be like a path. There's no penetrating that. They rule him out as being someone that can offer something to them, okay? So they sort of exhibit really the path type of soil. And what Mark is trying to tell us is, so all that's necessary to receive the message is faith. It's not about being family, because they miss it. They get it wrong. That's the point. So Mark is wanting us to see that where the family misses it, they don't have a position of privilege. Just because they grew up with them doesn't mean they really know. And in the same way, but for different reasons, Herod is close. He's got some good qualities, but he gives in to some of the other demands on him, some of the thorns, so to speak, that squelch that understanding and the hearing, the real hearing of the message. And so that's what Mark is trying to do. He wants us to make those associations like you just did. Not for the sake of just, kind of saying, I understand that little episode. No, he wants us to understand the big picture here of the whole gospel. And that's why he's going to keep giving us more examples to help us really get it and understand where our place in it all might be. But so that wasn't really off base. I think you're safe. You stole first.
Oh, good.
Yeah. Did I see any other hand? I think, Steve, yeah.
So listening to all the comments, the shifting soil and the situational nature of it, does that mean that faith is not a I have it or I don't have it concept, but more situational?
It's not about something we have or don't have. It's, yes, you're right. It's not something that's knowledge-based. It's not something that, again, the way we talked about the woman with the hemorrhaging who touched the hem, and we'll see other examples of this. I believe, help my unbelief. Faith is something that we might have in the same way that a mustard seed. We might only have a little bit, but it's enough. Faith can overcome fear. That's all that's necessary. There's no other training. There's no other learning that we need. There's no other instruction. It's just that faith can overcome fear. And when it does, fruit will come. When faith overcomes fear, that's good soil. But fear can interfere with faith. Fear can destroy faith. And there's examples of that. So it's not an either or. Faith is available to all. It's just, what do you do with faith when it comes to you? And that's part of where you are, I guess you could say, situationally. Because if we all exhibit different types of soil in our lives, are we being receptive now? And it's about an awareness as to when we're receptive, when we're not. What is it that's going on? Is fear, is life circumstances, is a hard right turn somewhere in our life that really jolts us, that sort of stuff. That's what Mark's helping us to see, how it is that when we respond with faith or fear, what that means, and then how to maybe move in a different direction. And again, not because it makes us good or bad, but just that's because that's what faith is. Faith and fear cannot coexist. I should say this: faith and fear can coexist, but one will become, more prominent. And Mark's trying to help us understand that faith, how faith can cast out fear, basically. Horty?
And it's a moment-to-moment decision about our faith.
Truly, yeah. You're right. It's not I got
the
saved.
The fear can win, the faith can win. And you have to continually, actively commit to it. And the action that you are being taught is the way.
Right. It's about a receptivity. Again, it's not, Mark isn't ever saying, okay, so when you've gotten healed and you receive the faith, that you go do this, and this. What he says is that the people who are healed, who are the good soil, they have faith first, and then they go out and they just exhibit it. They bear fruit. They share the message. That whatever that means, because sharing the message we often think it means going to tell people about our faith story. That's not necessarily what it means. To preach the gospel, I love the definition of, preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. It's about exhibiting the way of being in the world that is what Jesus taught. That's what it's about. So it's not about trying to define it for us and give us a hard list and this is only what it looks like. No, but it's about knowing that when we are responding with faith, we are not responding with fear, or we're not locked in our fear. And that's the key. That's the key right there. Okay, so a couple other things I wanted to get to. Let's see. Oh yeah. So after the successful interactions of the disciples, in verse 13, after the Herod story, we've suggested, this is a foreshadowing, right, of the disciples. Well, let's see if Mark thinks that's true, because what we see next is the story of going to the deserted place and the feeding of the 5,000. And I want to ask you, how do the disciples fare in that, call it that miracle story of the feeding of the 5,000? How do they look? Yeah, that says it right there. They don't get it. They don't get it. They miss the point. When Jesus says, you feed them, they're like, well, what do you expect? We're going to go out and buy all this. It's like, you're missing it. Okay. And again, it's not about a historical reaction like this. No, this is an illustration of what is becoming. When they started with looking so good, they're showing what Mark specifically starts to call. What does he say at the end? They don't get it. They didn't understand because their hearts were hardened. That's a very specific phrasing. Not meant to be literal, but certainly meant to connect to something very powerful. When you hear that phrase, what comes up for you? Who else's hearts were hardened?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh's heart was hardened? Absolutely. Who else in this story whose hearts are hardened?
the people in his own hometown.
Yeah, so the family, you could say, are definitely hardened hearts. And one other group.
Herod.
Not really Herod. I wouldn't say Herod. Herod was actually receptive. That's the more thorny example. But the Pharisees and the scribes, they're the ones that are hardened. From the beginning, it's monolithic, their way of interacting with Jesus. They discount him. They call him a blasphemer. They're hardened of heart. So it's really saying that the disciples are becoming more like that. That's the nature of rocky soil. That's a really powerful statement. So Mark is seeming to back up our assessment of why that story of Herod was inserted right there, because it's a foreshadowing, and Mark's picking right up on it because the disciples fall flat on their face right in that example. Okay. And then after that, we got that wonderful walking on water story, right? Which is very familiar sounding, isn't it? To the storm in the boat. It's the same kind of deal. These fishermen out again on a boat, and the weather gets rough. And this time Jesus is out walking on the water. And so what do you think that story is trying to tell us? Why those details about Jesus walking on water? What does that mean? And what does it mean when the disciples react the way they do? Horty. I'm sorry, Birdie. Go ahead, Horty.
I reacted to the part where it said he meant to pass them by. That he wasn't going to them. They had to call out to him. Or,
yes,
make some kind of a commotion that he noticed. That was not his intention to go out there and save them.
Excellent noticing. And that's an important detail for Mark there. Yeah.
Because I didn't get it.
Okay. I'll talk about it in a second.
I didn't understand why that was.
Okay, good. Birdie, because I will talk about that.
Yeah, I forgot what it was I wanted to say.
Sorry. Okay. If you raise your hand, I'll watch. But okay, the whole point of having Jesus walk out like that, is in much the same way as his interactions with the demons. Jesus is able to exhibit mastery over that which is chaotic to all else. Now, the sea is a metaphor for chaos. So Jesus is able to master the chaos of nature, but he can't master the will of his own disciples. That's the nature of freedom of choice. Okay, that's why he walks on the water. Why does he go by, though? Because what has Mark told us about how faith works? Faith cannot be assigned. Jesus can't force anyone to have faith. He was only going to walk out there so they could see him, but faith cannot be forced. They had to notice. That's what you were sort of saying, Horty. They had to be the ones that initiate and notice the faith, okay? So they call to him and he gets in the boat. Maybe that's their chance. He even stills the storm, again, showing power over nature, over the chaos of stuff that's beyond humanity. And he can't even control his own disciples. And that's the nature. That's human nature. That's what choice is. Freedom of choice means that. Okay? Does that clarify the whole walking on water story? He does it because it's a way of illustrating that mastery that he has, and yet the limitations of that. And also, why does he walk by? Because you can't force anyone to have faith. And if he had gone out to them, it would have just been, him sort of trying to impart this. See, there's a real subtle tool that Mark's using there. This is how faith works. You have to have it within yourself. No one can shove it, can make you have it first. And until that seed, even just that small amount, is present in you, then healing and receptivity to the message is not possible. It's a two-way street. Now, Birdie?
Yeah, what I wanted to say is that I think it's the fear. It's illustrating what fear does to our faith.
Absolutely.
If we were there and saw him calm a storm, I think our reaction would more be, awe and wonder rather than fear.
Exactly why Mark keeps giving us these examples, because as an audience, we're like, well, duh, do you see?
Yeah.
Do you see what he just did, disciples? And they keep forgetting. They keep missing it. They keep misunderstanding. And again, Mark is not saying, look at how bad they are. That's not the point. They are examples of a type of response that is a hardness. They look like they're going to be receptive. They've got all this advantage. They've got all this information. How do they miss it? Because it's not about information. It's not about how close you are to Jesus. It's about the seed of faith. That's all that's necessary within you. That's what exhibits good soil. Mark's trying to help us understand this, to break through, those places where, we might have misunderstood, because for all eternity, or for as long as there's been church, we look at the disciples, or we've wanted to look at the disciples as being the prime examples. Well, they're saints after all, right? No, Mark is not using them in that way. They're illustrations of how it's missed, and how fear particularly can interrupt faith. And here's the beautiful thing. We get that walking on water story, and then right at the end, there's this little few verses there at the end of chapter 6, which is sort of a summary of other healings that happen. Why do you think Mark puts that right there, right after the walking on water story with the disciples? What's the effect? What's the impact that has on us? Cordy?
Well, from that change in them, he demonstrated the calming and the mastery. And for a moment, they did get it, because it said as soon as they got out of the boat, everybody heard. Well, they couldn't have heard if they hadn't talked about it. So they must have communicated what the faith was to them, so that others found it contagious and then wanted to come to Jesus with the belief.
I don't know that it was communicated, though. There's no indication that there was a sharing of anything that happened there. And I think that's important, that there was no kind of communication to the crowds. But what is it that happens with the crowds when with all those 3 verses or so after the water story, the walking on water story? What happens in there?
They come running to him to get healed.
Yes, and they do get healed. So
Yeah.
there's an illustration of, that's a whole bunch of good soil right there. The point is, look at how the disciples are just missing it. These are the ones that are supposedly the insiders, based on what our worldly, we'd expect that to be the case. They've gotten all this information. How could they miss it? Well, they do. They do miss it, because there's a hardness of heart. There's a fear that's arising in them. And Jesus steps off the boat, and immediately there's all these crowds, and they are healed. They see him. They understand in the ways that the disciples just can't or don't. The crowds understand. And so healing happens. It is available still. It's not like, so it's so hard with the disciples because they have hardness of heart. It almost seems easy. Look at the way they come to him in throngs, and in the same way, it's like a reprise of the woman with the hemorrhaging. And all they have to do is touch him. It's not just touching, though. It's touching with faith. And that's communicated in here, that all these throngs come and they know and they believe and they're healed. It's not hard, folks. That's what Mark's trying to say. It's not hard. Being good soil means just getting out of your fear and really opening yourself to receiving the possibility of faith being made real within you, even if it's just a small amount. But he's playing with that idea that faith and fear, they're competing with each other. And one can win, for not necessarily for all time, but they just coexist in an even way. Faith and fear, they are competing. Any final comments? That's kind of the end of what I have for this chapter. Barb?
So I'm thinking also that the disciples have Jesus. I mean, they're in his in-group. And the crowds have nothing. And you know how when you have something, you don't want to give it up?
Yep.
And you get fearful?
Yep.
That's what's happened to the disciples.
Yes. Yes, it's so true. And I think it illustrates it on so many different levels. How often in our lives do we feel like when we have something, we don't want to give it up? And then that becomes, it lays claim to us.
Mm-hmm.
And what this is all about is that this faith-fear thing is what lays claim to you.
That's right.
What motivates each one of us at that deepest level. And that's that's just getting the truth. That's about getting the honesty about what motivates us and where we are. You know, it's not about paying lip service to our faith. It's not just saying, well, I'm a Christian and I have a bumper sticker and that makes me a Christian. It's more than that. And Mark's not concerned, you know, with giving us the list of, okay, this is what you have to do to be a Christian. No, he's just describing, this is the type of approach, this is the type of soil that's within us that will allow the message to best flourish. And there are so many ways that it's perilous, that it may not flourish when we allow ourselves to get sort of caught up in different things, or we're not receptive or that sort of thing. He's shaping these ways of receiving Jesus in a way that is evoking a lot of response. And as we continue to read this, you know, and you're doing this, I love watching it because I can see it happening in you, but we're not just reading narrative here. We're not just reading stories. We're reacting. We're in it. We're a part of it. We're looking over Mark's shoulder and Jesus' shoulder as we're like, okay, oh my gosh, what? I can't believe he did that. Yes, good. Mark wants us to react like that, okay? Because it's evoking a response in us that will help shape and move us. Okay, it's not telling us, it's not assigning us, it's nudging us to see with greater clarity the types of soil that we might nurture the good soil within us and let that be the soil I should say this, let that be the soil now in us. Because it's not for all time. It's just we make these choices. Marilyn? And then Carol and Bertie?
Yeah, I'm thinking of other metaphors in the Bible. The ask and it shall be given. And the knock and the door shall be opened unto you.
Yep.
In both of those cases, it has to come from the person. And the person isn't going to either knock or ask if they don't have the faith.
Right. And in both of those cases, it's not about a car or a house or $1 million. It's not a genie. Those knock and it shall be given to you. It has to do with the Holy Spirit. It has to do with the imparting of faith. That's what those are about. We make a mistake if we're like, well, knock and the door will be open, ask and it will be given to you. It's not about a house or a car. Okay, that stuff. That's about inviting faith in. And you're absolutely right. Mark is making that connection. That faith is something that we make the turn. You know, we initiate it. It doesn't just happen because we're walking and Jesus throws the seed on us and we're like, oh, what was that? Oh, I guess I have to know. And that's the whole walking on water story. Yeah. He doesn't just, you know, he's not telling them, and showing them and saying to make it so that, oh, well, I guess we have no choice here. I see it now. No, they have choice. They have to be able to see it from within themselves.
And if I could say something else real fast.
Sure. Yeah.
Today was wonderful, Dan. It really was. And I'm hoping so that I will remember what we've thought about and talked about today when I read the next assignment.
I know. Well, and that's why I decided to put an outline in this time, because I know that sometimes when we make these connections week to week, that's a long time. And I have to go over notes and notes and notes. And I've looked at this many, many times. So we have these recorded. So that's something. And then you'll have the access to your notes. But yes, I really hear you there. And I think there's a lot of resonance with that. Almost like you want to hold on to it all. And it's not always easy, but trust that enough will get in and impacts us. I see Jane with her hand up.
Mm-hmm. You know, these last few scripture verses for the first time really made me think about children coming. How children react to things, how children don't hang back and wait. They just rush forward. They beg you. My version says that they begged him to let them touch him. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we've been told that. We have to be like little children. We try to analyze, filter, do all these things. And sometimes it just complicates things so much that then we act like the disciples and we are wary, we're fearful.
Yes.
And, you know,
analysis,
really
paralysis, all these things. We get fettered. We get fettered as adults. There's just stuff that gets layered on us. And children often don't have those layers, those fetters, the blinders. They see with more clarity, with more innocence, with more purity. And that pure response is what is called for. That when Jesus says, come, we might just go with him instead of being like, well, you know what, blah, 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 I want to, and okay, I will. Well, I'm not, you know, all the ways that we get stuck. And that's where Mark is trying to help us see the differences in those responses and what they engender, what type of fruit they engender. Carol?
I was wondering, when it went to the part about rest, is that because the disciples, they're constantly working on faith, working and going with people? Is he saying sometimes you just have to step back and quit trying so hard?
Yes, absolutely. There's a couple layers of that. First of all, when you go back and compare it to chapter 3, there's a very specific reference to going to rest. So that's an oral cue that Mark's using to say, oh my gosh, they rested there. It's like the same way when you go look at chapter 3, and it's like they didn't have time to eat because they were so busy. Well, this says that exact thing again when it was like just before the feeding of the 5,000. It's like, well, and they hadn't had chance for leisure, so they hadn't eaten yet. It's all these cues that help us make connections. But more than that, Mark is trying to say what you just said, that faith is not something that we work for and learn and educate ourselves about. It's different than that. It's a way of being and responding in the world. It's not about having to strive and work and attain and acquire. It's about receiving. It's about creating the soil within ourselves. So we will get much closer to faith by taking deep times of call it rest, call it maybe meditation, whatever it is that prepares our soil to receive. It's not to say that it's only that, but it's more about the act of receiving as opposed to striving for and attaining or acquiring. But that's good noticing, because that's the nature of faith. It cannot be forced. It's much more, it's something we create to receive. Bertie.
Yeah, Horty was talking about communicating with the crowds, and I think it was more the crowds communicating amongst themselves. These 5,000 people who were fed would have gone out and told everybody, you know, come
Absolutely.
see what this man did. We all ate to our satisfaction, and when we were finished, there was even more than when we started.
Exactly. And there's this sense of building, of just sort of fame of the Jesus movement. And actually part of the foreboding part of the foreshadowing is if you go back and reread the Herod story, Herod's even heard of it. Herod is aware of the whole Jesus movement. So because of the fame, Jesus is being made more vulnerable now. And the movement itself is being made more vulnerable. We will see that. Because as we move through, you know, we're not that far from the end of all the miracles and the beginning of the Passion story. So the chapter 10 ends, that's when Jesus, all these beautiful healing stories, the so-called miracle stories, that's when they end, and we go into Passion for the rest of the narrative. So Jesus' work is, we're starting to see how it can be threatened by fear. When fear, it starts to take hold, when other, you know, influences, you know, like the Herods of this world or the you know, you can come in and it's vulnerable. Evil exists. And fear exists. So that's what we're seeing, is that it matters. Jesus is not powerful except for being surrounded by those who exhibit faith. That's a key. That's a key here. What we do, how we decide, the soil we are, matters. Jesus can't do this by himself. That's one of the most succinct and I think important keys that Mark wants us to really understand. All the power that Jesus has is limited by the response that he sees. That's where that first portion of this chapter was going. He had no power to do miracles when he was not surrounded by faithful soil, by good soil. So he had to leave. This is part of what Mark's shaping here. There's this sense of, ooh, this Jesus is in a vulnerable position. Now we already know he's going to die. He will be betrayed, all that stuff, but we haven't yet seen it fully. But Mark's shaping us. He's moving us in that direction. We're starting to see, oh my gosh, my decision matters. What team am I going to be on? The team of fear or the team of faith? Am I going to walk with Jesus? This is what he's starting to shape in us, the way we react to the different stories and the different characters. It's like, oh my gosh, I can't believe he did that. I wouldn't have done that. We might be saying these things inside. Mark wants us to react like that. and then move forward, with him, move more in alignment with Jesus. Okay. It's wonderful. And he only needs 16 chapters to do it, unlike Matthew and Luke, which just much more verbose. So I like getting right to it. So it's all wonderful. Any last comments? Thank you has been a rich class, and I'm just always so glad for the questions and comments. You make me a better teacher. Huh?
Just thank you.
Yeah.
You're welcome. Thank you all, and look forward to seeing you next week. For next session, we'll read Mark chapter 7. Take care. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.